Welcome to the Human Services Council, and thank you for taking an important step on behalf of your organization, your staff, and your clients. HSC is the way that nonprofit human service providers can work together to advocate for the sector and for the clients they serve. This webinar is a project of HSC's Disaster Readiness and Resiliency Initiative, funded in part by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, to ensure both that organizations can help those who need them after disaster and so that they can continue to fulfill their normal functions. HSC helps organizations prepare for emergencies. Our activities include the HS Alert Emergency Communications System, training like this on effective and practical emergency planning, creating and maintaining an emergency plan template suitable for nonprofit human services providers, continuing research on the sector's readiness, and maintaining ongoing relationships with government, nonprofit, and other partners. This webinar is an introduction to the training that HSC scheduled for Tuesday, April 7th and Monday, April 20th. As I'm sure you've experienced, the situation changes quickly and all plans are subject to change. We're offering this webinar as a special presentation to introduce the training. We'll be looking at how your experience in the current pandemic applies to emergency planning more generally, and we'll identify some of the basic concepts we need to discuss emergency planning meaningfully. I'm Haim Abadia, and I am the presenter for this webinar. Jason Wu and Jennifer Diamond are managing the technology and logistics. So we have two objectives in this brief webinar. First, we want to relate the experiences we're having during this pandemic to emergency planning more generally, and we'll explain later what all-hazard planning means. Secondly, we'll become familiar with important concepts in emergency planning that we'll be using in the training. These are some of the questions that you may have been asking yourself. What happened? What's going to happen? What can we do about it? And you may have registered for this training because you wondered how to prepare for the next COVID-19. And that question actually has the easiest answer. You don't. Do not plan for the next pandemic. Plan for the next emergency, whatever it might be. If you had known as a certainty 2 months ago that there would be a pandemic that would close schools, ban sporting events, and restrict most of the population to their homes, how would you have spent those 2 months? My guess would be that you would be getting ready to take the actions that you have in fact needed to take in the past weeks, so that you, your staff, and your clients would be less traumatized. You would be rethinking your programs to consider how to make transitioning to a different service model less disruptive. You would be thinking about how to mitigate the financial impact on the organization, and more. I can't say that I knew this pandemic was coming, but when I gave a training this past September, well before any of us had heard the name COVID-19, I asked these questions. Now, I didn't ask the exact questions that I would now, but if you had thought about these questions 2 months ago, you might have come across answers to some of the questions you've confronted recently. So let me tell you, the next emergency is coming. Probably not a pandemic like this one. Maybe it'll be a natural disaster, or maybe it'll be mass violence, or maybe something else. But it is coming. And I hope you'll find that this training will help you think about how you can best deal with it when it does come. It may, for example, be a snowstorm. You probably had to deal with a snowstorm before, but what if it's a storm of the size that happens once in a decade? Have you thought through the impact on your organization, your staff, your clients? You may have asked the very same questions when you first realized that you'd have to deal with COVID-19. Again, we see that a lot of being prepared is being prepared for all kinds of emergencies. In this case, since you've experienced other snowstorms, you do have some idea of the situation you'd have to deal with. But what if it's something you've not experienced before? Suppose it's a terrorist attack that requires everyone to shelter in place. And by shelter in place, I don't mean staying home and only leaving for groceries and other necessities. I mean not stepping outside wherever you happen to be at the time and duct taping the windows. This may seem like an unlikely and extreme scenario, but let me assure you that your local police, fire, and other government emergency personnel have been planning for just this scenario, among others. The questions you need to ask in the process of planning for emergencies need to address how the organization may be impacted, but also how your staff and clients may be affected. In an emergency, will all of them understand instructions? Even if they understand them, will they follow them? Or will they, as a matter of course, not do anything the government tells them to do because they come from a place where government can never be trusted? Sheltering in place means everyone, in whatever place they are. What if it's in the middle of the day and you need to accommodate everyone that happens to be at your site? You need 1 gallon of water per person per day for a minimum of 3 days. Let's talk now about some basic concepts. If you haven't already checked out HSC's website, go there for up-to-date information on COVID-19, and in particular, for the impact on human services providers. Lots of good info. Do you have other sources of reliable info on COVID-19? If not, how do you get them? If so, will they continue to be sources of information on other disasters? You can't convey accurate and reliable information to staff and clients if you don't know how to get accurate and reliable information for yourself. This brings me to a critically important topic which cannot be overemphasized. The single greatest danger in an emergency is false or misleading information. What and how you communicate is a tremendous responsibility. That responsibility is to be truthful, accurate, and non-alarmist. This, for example, is a notice issued by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene a few weeks ago, and there are a few things to note here. First, it's important to keep in mind that disasters like this one have powerful emotional impact. So it's important that we always share information only from reliable sources. There are people who will look to you as their most trusted source of information, and you owe it to them to provide accurate information. Next, remember that a crisis can bring out the best in people, but it can also bring out the worst. The most vulnerable people in our society are those who are going to also be the most vulnerable in a crisis. You've seen that hate crimes against Asian Americans significantly increased after COVID-19 became news. Finally, Be conscientious about helping people focus on coping in a constructive, positive way. The best way to fight fear is with truth. Be conscious not only of what you are saying, but also of how it will be understood. So we're ready now to communicate responsibly, and let's move on to asking some questions about how this disaster is affecting and will affect your organization. When the emergency is over, the likelihood is it will not be over. If you're fortunate, you'll be able to operate during an emergency and need to consider how you might need to adjust to the impact. How is COVID-19 affecting your clients? How are they coping? What are you learning about what their needs are? Some of you will not be able to provide services as usual. In New York City, for example, senior centers are not operating any on-site program, but they are providing meals to go. In some cases, you'll modify your service model, but in some cases, you'll need to stop offering one or more services. Have you thought about how you'll start providing those services again after the crisis? Fortunately, this is not a crisis that caused damage to your physical facility, nor will it be difficult to travel once services need to resume. But in another kind of disaster, if any of your operations have been shut down, one of the most important questions for you is, how will you get back up and running as soon as possible? Think about how COVID-19 has affected your organization, but also about which effects were most challenging to deal with, which effects showed you gaps in your infrastructure, which effects hit different populations of clients differently. And think too about how this emergency compares to other experiences you've had. In addition to the challenges of stopping services or modifying them substantially, there may be impact on your budget. And some disasters may have direct impact on your facility. You may be already seeing in this crisis that staff are having reactions to the situation. And as we said earlier, clients may expect different things of you. The impact of an emergency on an organization can be significant, and thinking ahead is the best defense. So let's look now at some definitions of terms that you'll use regularly during emergency planning. Don't think that these definitions are absolute and universal. They're specifically applicable to how they will be used in emergency planning. And what they do is enable us to have discussions with some confidence that we'll understand each other. An emergency can be something as small as a medical emergency for a single staff person or client, or something that affects the entire country. The key elements are that it is a threat to life or health and that immediate action is required. In many cases, an emergency happens without warning, but that's not always true. And not every emergency is a disaster, but indeed every disaster is an emergency. If an emergency is large enough to impact the entire community, it's a disaster. Notice that this definition includes the assumption that the disruption caused by disaster means that people will need help. And that's where we come in. So, what is it exactly that we're going to be planning for? When I say that we should prepare for whatever emergency might come, it means we're taking an all hazards approach to planning. A hazard is any situation that can harm the community or its environment. These are a few examples of hazards. Some of them you've experienced yourself, and some you haven't yourself experienced, but you've seen that they happen in other parts of the country or of the world. On the other hand, some of these you may not expect to see ever. Some are more likely, some are less likely. Risk is the likelihood of a hazard actually happening. For example, in New York, the risk of a hurricane is far greater than the risk of a tornado, while the risk of a volcanic eruption is close to zero. So if we look at that list of hazards, we can identify some as having very low risk for us here in New York. And we can also identify some as having a low risk. And similarly with our second list, some are low risk and some are of less risk. In most cases, we have no control over whether a hazard exists and how likely it is to actually occur. But we can make a difference in how vulnerable we are. And we need to understand that what makes a community more or less vulnerable to the impact of a disaster varies. Whether the ground is sand or rock can make a big difference in vulnerability to an earthquake, but might be irrelevant, for example, to a radiation incident. And we need to understand that vulnerability can be an issue of equity. Economic status is a major factor in how vulnerable a household or a community is to a pandemic. That's a reminder to be sure that planning includes a social equity lens. The nature of a hazard, the risk of it happening, and a community's vulnerability are all factors in what will actually happen as a result of a disaster. That is, they determine what the impact will be. Impact is the consequences of a hazard occurring, or to put it more simply, impact is the problems you'll need to deal with. Different kinds of disasters can have different kinds of impacts, but often an impact can be caused by a number of kinds of disaster. We recommend focusing less on planning for hazards and more on planning for impacts. It doesn't really matter whether the loss of power was caused by a hurricane, an explosion, or a flood. What you need to deal with is the loss of power. If mass transit is shut down, it's the shutdown you need to deal with, regardless of whether it resulted from storm surge, a labor strike, or lightning strikes. So understanding what an emergency is and what a disaster is, knowing that hazards have greater or lesser risk, recognizing that our communities can be more or less vulnerable, and seeing that we'll need to deal with the impact. Let's think more specifically about what that means for your organization. Has COVID-19 impacted your organization in any of these ways that we spoke about? Has it had different impacts on your different programs? Which of these impacts were you better prepared for and which less? Have some impacts had primarily short-term consequences and others long-term? All of this experience can inform your planning for the future. But now let's begin to think more generally than COVID-19. I'd like to ask that you do a small exercise that'll help you get ready for our next session. You can work on it between now and then. First, take a sheet of paper. Divide it into 4 columns. Draw a horizontal line and in the first box write Services. Then draw more horizontal lines, leaving space to write in the boxes. Under Services, list some of the services your organization provides. Here I'm just using childcare and senior services as examples. List as many as fit on your page. Over the top of the other 3 columns, write Impact. And under Impact, above each of the 3 columns, write in a different kind of impact that a disaster can have. For example, you might write loss of electricity. In case you need ideas, I'll give you one more look at the list we made before. But feel free to write in something that is not on the list. And of course, you can always pause the webinar and rewind anytime you want to take another look at the list. So I've written classrooms flooded and transit shut down as my other examples. Now, fill in the boxes with a description of how that impact will affect the services you listed. In your child care program, you'll need lights, and maybe you have ones that are battery operated. List other things you think of as well. And if the classrooms are flooded, you'll need to relocate. Continue in the same way. And then move on to the next service on your list. The lack of electricity has a different effect on senior services than it does on child care. So between now and the next session, fill in all the boxes that you can. Save this chart and bring it with you when you come to the next episode in this training. Thank you again for joining Human Services Council's training, Emergency Planning for Human Services Providers. Be sure to join us next time. This training has been made available to all human services organizations, but HSC provides other services for its members. To learn more, go to the website or email info@humanservicescouncil.org.